Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for making the trip here to our live audience and our live stream. We're happy to welcome you to our quarterly Q'd In event. And for those of you who haven't attended in the past, it's really focused on contact center professionals to really help them figure out new and exciting ways to make a difference. I think we see a lot of change happening in our industry these days, especially around customer service. And we're happy to provide some of that insight and knowledge that we have across several of our different areas of focus to you. So hopefully this is actionable and something you can take away. And just a little bit about CPI. So we help over 120,000 business professionals connect with their customers every single day. Focused on 4 areas, from phone systems and contact center to CRM and collaboration. The full suite from implementation to ongoing success across 4 different platforms that we've been supporting for a number of years. And just a heads up, a little bit of housekeeping here. We actually have a survey. There is, for our in-house audience, we have a paper survey. We would really like to take the time to fill it out at the end of the event because it really helps us shape these and improve these over time. And for those of you on the live stream, we actually have a website link there. If you go to that, you can fill it out. And if you do, there's actually a little something for you. So we'll be having some door prizes for our in-audience group. And for our live stream group, we're actually going to have a $5 Starbucks gift card for the first 15 surveys turned in after our 1 o'clock ending. So please, I'll give you just a second to write down the survey. Hope you can provide some feedback that really helps us continue to improve these events. And for questions and answers, something just to beware for the audience here in-house. If you wouldn't mind taking your notebooks and write them down and raise your hand up and then pass them to me. I'll take them up to Derek and we'll do that. And for the live stream audience, we actually have a YouTube live chat. So if you could post your questions in there, we'll make sure those get to Derek to answer. And you can do that. I just have a screenshot here. It's on the right-hand side. There's a live chat. So with that, I'm going to thank you for coming today, and I am going to introduce Derek Chin, our presenter. Thank you, Derek.
Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. Well, I know today everybody's here and everybody's looking forward to hearing about knowledge. And you know, so the one thing that I definitely want to start off with is I want to start off with some of the topics that we're going to be talking about. So you can see here that, you know, there's really 3 main areas that we want to address. And for the most part, you know, we're going to kind of dabble around these areas, but the one thing that I would encourage anybody to do is, as you guys are submitting your questions, please feel free to submit questions, you know, just if it's related to the topic or kind of sort of related, please go ahead and make those submissions. So what we want to address today is, first and foremost, can knowledge base be more than what it already is for your organization, right? And what we're talking about here is we're talking about what it was, what it is, and what it can be. So we're going to touch on that. I also want to talk about how knowledge really for us is more of a commodity. It's something that can be valued in your organization, and it really is something that is not like you put on a checklist where you say, okay, we're done, and you know that's the last that you ever talk about it. And then last but not least is harvesting knowledge doesn't have to be lonely. So we'll talk about that, and more importantly, we'll help you guys to understand some best practices and some tips and tricks that really will help you to understand how knowledge how it currently lives within your organization, but most importantly, how you can extract it and use it, you know, for every agent, not just the agents that, you know, happen to know all the information. So just an introduction, my name is Derek Chin. I am the Director of CX Solutions for CPI. Specifically, I work with the Service Cloud, the Oracle Service Cloud product line. You know, but my background really is, you know, in learning development and specifically knowledge management. And so, you know, I'm excited to be here to speak to everybody, and I certainly, you know, I welcome any of the questions that you have. So what I want to talk about now is I want to do a little story time, you know, so hopefully everybody here is ready for a little bit of a story. So I want to tell you the story of the first time I met my knowledge base. So in one of my first contact center jobs, I actually, you know, I got the tour, right? And so, you know, I went into the facility and I was thinking, man, you know, I knew how to do all this stuff. And, you know, so I wanted to kind of get to know some of the players. And what I found was that when I actually met a lot of the people, you know, there was varying levels of knowledge. There was new agents that, you know, they didn't know anything, but they had a bright smile on their face. They were happy to be at work. There were the more experienced agents, some happy, some not. And then there were agents that were kind of in between, right, where they got the job done, but they wouldn't necessarily be the star agent, quote unquote star agent. But there was one agent that I met that really, really stood out to me, and her name was Deb. So the interesting part was that when I met Deb, she welcomed me with open arms, and she knew that, I was brand new to the organization. I was brand new to what I was doing with the contact center, and she wanted to make sure that I felt comfortable. She wanted to make sure that I knew how everything was supposed to work. And so, she took me under her wing, she talked me through every single step, and she really made me feel like I was part of something, and that, more importantly, that there was a rhyme and a reason to every single thing that we were doing within the contact center. So as we kind of talked through those things, I started to really feel very comfortable. So later on that day, we kind of went our separate ways. I went to go meet some other folks, and I would see Deb actually interacting with other agents, specifically new agents, and she'd have that same kind of rapport, the same kind of knowledge. Any question that they could come up with, she was able to give an answer. And I said, wow, this is great. This is fantastic how we can actually convey that information, right? And so at that point, I kind of noticed that, as I talked to people, I would ask them, who did your training, or who helped you to understand what it is that we do in the contact center? And some people would say Deb, some people would say somebody else, and there was a pattern. There was a pattern that everybody that Deb was able to influence, they were significantly better in terms of what they understood, how they approached things, and it was definitely more consistent. So with that said, I kind of thought to myself, well, that's kind of interesting, right? So, coming from a background of learning and development, I was always kind of taught about structure and delivery and all that kind of, the formalities of learning and development. But the one thing that really always rang true is that your training really is only as good as the person delivering it, right? And so if the person delivering it doesn't understand what you wrote down on the piece of paper, it's not going to come across in the same way. And most importantly, it may not actually be accessible, especially if the new person doesn't know about it, and they probably won't. So I thought this quote was kind of an interesting quote, and so this is a quote from Mark Twain, and it says, "All I need in life is ignorance and confidence, and success is sure." I think that's true, right? I mean, for the most part, it's like I think some of this is really just, putting your head down, doing what you need to do, and, focusing on the important things, and if you can do that, you're good to go. But I would say, specifically in the realm of knowledge, and knowledge as it pertains to your contact center, I don't know if that's always true, right? So ignorance is definitely, one of those things where we want to make sure that we control that, so because we want all of our agents, and especially the customer-facing individuals in our organization, we want them to have the right information at the right time and directing it to the right audience. So I want to tell you about the time I met the other knowledge base. So this was an individual. We'll go ahead and we'll call him Walter, right? So this individual was the other person that actually had a lot of influence in our contact center. Now, what was interesting is that, he certainly had a very, very confident air about him, and he was very, very sure about a lot of his answers, and what I found out is that he'd only been there for a few weeks. And I was like, oh, that's kind of weird. You're really, really sure. Well, that's great. I'm glad. I'm always looking forward to meeting new people and meeting people that, really kind of have a knack for this kind of stuff. Well, I mean, he had the attitude that he had been there for years, right? So you'd only been there for a few weeks, but, you're talking like a veteran. You definitely were very, very sure about the things that you were talking about. What I also found out was that his information was usually about 50% right? So here's where the difference is between Deb and Walter, right? Deb was very confident. She was very warm. She was definitely the face of the contact center. And what she provided was she provided this experience that really, really made it a great experience for those new agents. But then Walter kind of just did it because he wanted the notoriety of saying, hey, I'm the one that gave you the answer, or, I can chime in even though, maybe he doesn't know the right answer, or maybe he shouldn't chime in, right? He did anyway. So I want you guys to kind of keep that in mind. As you think about your individual organizations, who are those individuals for you? Because I can tell you there's a Deb in your organization, and I can tell you there's a Walter, right? And that's something that is going to be very important as we kind of think through what this looks like. So I want to define knowledge, right? So as we talk about knowledge, what I want to do is I want to really kind of level set with everybody. We're just going to create a definition here. Well, Merriam-Webster is going to create a definition. I'm just going to quote it. So the definition is the sum of what is known, right? The body of truth, information, and principles acquired by mankind. So that's the official definition. I want to focus on the sum of what is known. So if we focus on the sum of what is known, and we really look at knowledge as the consolidation of those things that we know, how is it that we can really leverage this within our contact centers, right? And I think if going back to the Deb and Walter model, you can see that it's one single person that's providing all of this knowledge. They're the keeper of the key. So if Deb's out, we have no knowledge, right? If Deb is on break, we have no knowledge. If Deb happens to, to be there and she just happens to be there in the vicinity of the person who has the question, she's there. Or even worse, and this is probably the more realistic example, is that all of your agents had learned that Deb is the person who has all the answers, so they send her an instant message and they say, hey Deb, I got a question about this, right? Next thing you know, she's no longer handling tier 1 calls, she's actually now handling all of the IMs from all the other agents, right? And so that's something that I want to kind of put out there for you guys. So I want to ask you, in terms of your organizations, as we look at knowledge and as we define it as what is known, how does it look for your organization? So we have two models here, right? And today we'll just focus on the two models. So the first model I'd like to focus on is what we refer to as frequently asked questions, right? FAQ for short. And the definition here is that this is a document. Typically it's a static document that we present typical questions that we believe that people typically might ask, and we give a typical answer, right? So, I think it makes sense logically to offer that. We also have a definition of a knowledge base, right? And the key difference here is that a knowledge base is not a static collection, but it's a dynamic resource that actually allows itself to learn over time. So what do we mean by that? Well, in an FAQ, the model is that we typically spend a whole lot of time on the front end, right? And this is maybe meeting after meeting after meeting, and then a meeting about the meeting, right? Where we talk about the FAQ, and we make sure that content is absolutely perfect before we send it up, right? Send it to marketing, send it to legal to make sure, especially if this is public facing, they do all their approvals, and it goes up there, right? And it's a sight to admire, right? Because it's a lot of time and effort that it took for everybody to put this together, but then that's it. Right? We leave it up there and we say, oh, we have an FAQ. We no longer need to touch it. We no longer need to change it. But is that really always true? Especially as your business changes on a day-to-day basis, right? For a knowledge base, this is something that really is meant to grow along with your business, right? For the tool that I specialize in, the Oracle Service Cloud tool, it's something that it literally learns every day. So every time somebody accesses an answer, that answer becomes higher on the list. So the more people that access the answer, the more relevant that information becomes. So you can see that you're building credibility through things like, the dynamic movements, and also it also gives you some real-time visibility to say, yes, this is or isn't effective to things like volume diversion. So I want to pose 3 questions for everybody here, as we kind of think through what your knowledge really looks like. As we talk about knowledge, we talk about what it is, we talk about the forms in which they currently take in your organization. But there are 3 general goals that I look for when I talk about building a knowledge base and really structuring it from the ground up. There are 3 things that I really look for. So the first thing that I look for is, are you shifting volume? And I think it may or may not hit on how you guys currently look at knowledge. But when you think about knowledge, a question I would throw in there is, what role does knowledge play in your volume strategy, right? We typically look at, we're going to get X amount of telephone calls, we're going to get X amount of chats, we're going to get X amount of emails. You may even get paper letters through snail mail. That happens too, right? Or you may get walk-ins. But the question I would ask is, how does the knowledge offering that you're putting out there, how does that affect that overall volume, right? With really good knowledge, you could answer the question before they even submit anything to you, right? So if you think about that correlation and how it relates to things like, headcount, right? So do you need somebody to man a ticket if the ticket's already answered, right? Do you need to create a ticket if the ticket's already answered? Those are the questions that I would certainly put out there in terms of shifting volume. The other thing that I would say is that it's not always about volume diversion. Sometimes it's about right channeling, right? There may be questions out there where somebody's, in their mind, they are set to not talk to anybody, right? They don't want to call you, they don't want to chat with you, they don't want to send an email, right? But the only way that your organization may be set up to answer that question is by telephone, right? You have to call the agent, you have to talk through whatever you need to talk through. Your customer's not going to know that, but if you offer the knowledge answer, you can actually funnel them to the correct channel, so that as an organization, that helps you to really control the volume and put it where you're expecting it, to put it where they don't have to get escalated to a channel where they end up having to come back anyway, right? So when we're talking about shifting volume, that's potentially where some of those strategies and thought processes come into play. The next thing that I'll bring up is self-administering. So does your knowledge do the maintenance work for you? This is this is kind of an interesting kind of spin on knowledge, because typically you think, like, as we talked about before, you think about knowledge being that FAQ piece, right? Well, the FAQ, does the FAQ actually maintain itself? Does it make itself more relevant every day? Probably not. That'd be really cool if you could do that, right? But probably not. So with the FAQ, it is what it is. It's static. It doesn't change over time. It doesn't change based on the type of volume you're getting. So in the self-administration, does it start to fix things? Does it also tell you when content has actually been live for a certain amount of time? So for instance, does your FAQ ping you and say, hey, this content has been up for 6 months, it may be due for review, right? Or any of those kind of indicators. So those are the kind of things that really, when you think about knowledge base and you think about the effectiveness of knowledge base, it's not about doing more work, right? It's about getting the system of your choosing to do the work for you, right? And when we talk about the self-administration, it's also about the design, right? As you're designing this, is this something that you want to put this back on yourself? Do you assign you to review all those things? Or, potentially is there a larger audience in which we can invite to really see some of those things? So the last thing is agent owned, right? As you talk about your contact center, or really your agent pool, or the pool of people that actually are using the tool, what you find that there's this ownership that happens with things that they do on a regular basis, right? When you talk to them about how they fill out tickets, they own every one of those tickets, right? And I guarantee you, if you ask them about a call that they took, they'll tell you about the call, because they took the call, they own the call from start to finish. What we have in the knowledge base, though, is that we typically don't really involve the agents to that degree. It's usually something that leadership has a meeting about, they decide as a group, and they say, this is the most important knowledge, and then it's disseminated across the agents. So with that thought process, then what I would ask you is that knowledge actually speaking to the types of issues that your agents are actually seeing? Right? I mean, so, and as we think about the ownership of that, right, what if it's wrong? Right? What if it's exactly, what if it's 95% correct, but there's one little piece that your agents have started to add to their dialogue because they take this call every day, but you as a manager, you didn't know about it, right? I mean, it's a reality that those kind of things might happen, right? Where the business has evolved and, the person that's actually creating the content may not know that. So I would ask you, is your content coming from the front line, right? And are there other ways that you can put that out there? In terms of, are there, potential agent working groups that really help to build the content, And it doesn't necessarily mean that every single one of your agents is going to be creating the content for you. It could just be a key number of agents or agent leaders, but people that are trusted, people that are actually taking these calls, so that the content that you're creating, and specifically the knowledge that you're creating, actually then is relatable to what we're actually talking about. So what I would kind of at least end this segment on is I would kind of talk about how every day you guys go into your contact center, there actually is knowledge already there, right? we always look at knowledge bases as something that is a little bit abstract, definitely something that we're going to have to sit down and do a lot of work on. And I'm not saying that there's not work involved with it, but I would ask you guys, how can we extract some of that knowledge when it comes to what's there? So I do want to kind of say this statement. It's time to harvest some of that knowledge, right? So out of your agents, how do we actually get them to really draw out some of those things, those little tidbits, those things that Deb would tell me or tell every single agent? How do we get them into every single agent's mind? Every time they take a call, they're going to give the Deb answer. They're not going to give the Walter answer, right? Or every single time that we have a customer conflict or something where it's potentially a stressful situation, and there are stressful situations. How do we make sure that they feel comfortable with what needs to happen? So I do want to kind of point it to Chris here. So I know that we have some questions that have kind of come through, and I want to maybe make this a little bit more of a live dialogue, because the part of this that I want everybody, whether you're over the web or you're here in this room, to be able to do is to ask the questions that I think that are relevant to you. So
yeah, and we have a couple questions we're going to talk through just as a Q&A, common questions that we run into on a daily basis that we're going to pose to Derek so he can talk us through them. So, one of them that we see quite frequently, a question that's asked to us is, how do we know that we're measuring the right thing when it comes to knowledge management?
That's a great question. So, as we look at the measurement of things, right, because ultimately you need to explain to your boss why there's benefit for you to use knowledge, right? And the measuring piece is really where the value, that's how you're going to show value. So when we talk about measuring, there's a few ways to look at measurement. There's always the agent productivity, right? Because you would imagine, right, that if your agents have the right knowledge, they know how to answer the questions, then those classical kind of measurements like average handle time or average speed to answer, those kind of typical contact center measurements would in fact improve, because if you're not always having to put your customer on hold, go ask somebody the question, or go ask a manager to escalate it or whatnot, you'd be able to see that. Also things like first call resolution, right? Because the realities is that if you give the wrong answer and then you say, oh, ticket's closed, right? Is it really closed? Or it's closed until they call you back and then you have to reopen the ticket, or worse, you actually open another ticket and the whole cycle starts all over again.
Good. So I'd encourage folks, we've got a number of questions we're going to go through to post online. Also, if you'd like to ask a question from the audience, feel free to write one down and we'll get it to Derek. Here's another common question we run into. So I've been measuring the same thing and it doesn't seem to have the same effect as it did when I first started. So what am I doing wrong?
Okay. Has anybody experienced that issue? Anybody start measuring something and, and whether it's, either knowledge usage or, you're looking at some of those metrics we even mentioned, like average handle time. So here's the reality is that these measurements, they move along just like your business does. And what we can't do is you can't always just say, oh, this is the only measurement. All of your measurements really have to fit into a composite of things that you're looking at, right? So it's not always just about average handle time, but it may be something related to like a QA score or like a quality score that, are they actually answering the questions with the right answers that we want to provide? Maybe it's not just about making sure that they're using the knowledge, but, that they're actually using the knowledge, potentially contributing to the knowledge base, right? So as you think about these metrics, it will help to actually have a strategy. So when you're talking about it, it's not just always about the one item, but it could be, in fact, more about a strategic picture. And certainly, as that evolves, you'll find that that picture becomes clearer and clearer as you begin to measure those individual items.
Thank you. So another typical one, I know we're talking a lot about measurement now, but measurement's so critical in the contact center. We measure everything. But should I be measuring knowledge in the same way for both my internal team and my customers, or should they be different?
So what you're going to find is you're going to find a really, really distinct difference between your team versus your customers. And here's the biggest difference. Your team knows what it should be, right? your customers knows what they want it to be, right? And that's a very, very different mindset, right? Because your customers don't know anything about your internal procedures. They don't know anything about what you guys do as a process. And so really the biggest difference is how you want to frame it. Now, it's very helpful for an agent to actually see the content that makes sense to them. So in their knowledge article, you may actually provide the actual steps of procedure, right? So you're going to open up this tool, you're going to click this button. You can give them the step-by-step and give them very, very granular information versus something that you might actually present to a customer where it's going to be the exact opposite. It's going to be very high level. You're not going to talk about your business process. You know, you may actually just say, you're going to need to give us a call at, 1-800 XYZ.
Thank you. So you talked a lot in the beginning about the difference between FAQs and a knowledge base. And so if I'm an organization and if I have, a couple hundred FAQs, what do I do? How do I get started?
And that's a very common question because, you think back to the amount of time that you had to spend going through and creating the FAQ to begin with, right? And in your mind, that's a very daunting task. I'll tell you, for anybody, that's a very daunting task. We've actually met some organizations that had 200, 300, 400 types of FAQs that they put out there, right? Because just over the last 5, 6 years, you add 100 a year and here you are with 500 FAQs. So really for us, and especially if you're migrating from an FAQ to a knowledge base, what we always suggest is to really, really trim it down, right? Because what you're going to find is you're going to find that out of those 300, 400 articles or the lines in the FAQ, you're really only using maybe 25 to at the most 50 at any given time, depending on your volume. And so, I'm a huge fan of really taking a mindset of 80-20, right? Where you're going to look for the 20% of things that really will affect the 80% of your volume. And with that mindset, typically starting with a small set where you can either look at it in terms of ticket disposition and match it up that way, or what you can do is just ask your agents, what are the types of calls that you guys are getting frequent things about? And if we were to really pare it down to 25 to 50 questions, what would those 25 to 50 questions be? Excellent.
So I'm a new knowledge base admitter. I walked into an organization, have a knowledge base, I'm new in my position. And so day one, what do I do to get started so I'm making a big impact to my organization since this is all new to me? How do I get there?
Yeah, no, that's, so, I think, and this is something that you're going to find in any organization and any industry. It doesn't really matter. The first thing that I would always recommend for new knowledge managers is to understand what it is that you're trying to teach, right? And it seems like such a really trivial kind of basic thing to say, but it's so important because you're effectively going to be creating the truth, right? This is the truth for your agents. They're supposed to go into the knowledge base. They're supposed to be able to find the answer, right? And the only way you're going to get that kind of connection is if you can create that credibility. The only way you're going to have credibility is if you actually understand on your own. So I would say the very first start is to understand what it is that you're trying to teach them and to get them comfortable with, and also to really find those key agents that can be partners.
So if I'm an organization, I'm used to managing FAQs through the arduous process you described earlier today. And how do you think through refreshing a real knowledge base versus an FAQ? So what do you do? How do you refresh that? Is it 6 months? Is it 3 months? How does it work?
Yeah, so the beauty of a knowledge base is that it can be year-round, right? And I always equate this to something like cleaning the gutters at your house, right? If you save that kind of maintenance for your house to once a year, you're going to have a whole bunch of leaves to clean, and it's going to take you all day long. It may take you a couple days, right? And you're going to have to really, really get into it. But if it's something where maybe you take a small section, every month or, every other month or every quarter, and you just kind of make small chunks, no longer does it have to take that long duration of time. And you can really think about your knowledge base in a very similar way, right? Where you actually group the knowledge together where it actually is now a much more manageable piece. The other thing that I would say is, this is not a process. Knowledge should not be a process where you assign somebody a task, right? As I talked about before, knowledge is a commodity. It's not a task. It's not something you assign to somebody and then you say, okay, you got it. Right? It's something that we should really be thinking about as a community. So, there's nothing wrong with starting to delegate a working group, right? And we see many organizations where they actually have multiple groups. They might have a larger agent group, right? Like a tier 1 group of key agents where they actually start to review some of the answers that are actually submitted. Some organizations even have it where they allow everybody to submit their knowledge. And then what happens is that knowledge goes into a repository. It's vetted by the first tier group. The first tier group then passes it on to the review group. And then, now what it becomes is it becomes this more organizational process, and it's not just the responsibility of that one person, so that, it's always moving and it stays organic.
So, I want to create a robust knowledge base if I'm an organization, but I don't have a team of people. And so it may not even have a huge budget to get started. How would you recommend an organization who doesn't have a lot of resources just to assign to it? Where do you get the content from day one? How do you start that process?
Yeah, and I would go back to what I was just mentioning. This is really an opportunity for you to create that agent ownership, right, by allowing your agents to create submissions, right? And so, in the tool that we implement, Oracle Service Cloud, there's a functionality that actually allows you to propose answers. So every single agent has the ability to submit an answer. It goes to the committee, and you can change the visibility to one person or a number of people. But at that point, we're submitting real answers, and what can happen is that they'll either verify this answer already exists or it doesn't exist, and then we can tweak the language so that it actually makes sense based on whatever the process is. So things are real, and what also happens with that is, you add a requirement for your agents where everybody, no matter how monotonous this question is, they have to search the knowledge base, because then what you're actually utilizing your agents to do is to validate that the knowledge actually exists. Or if it does exist, is it current, right? So they have a dual functionality. They're going to submit answers to you, and they're also going to verify the validity of those answers.
Okay. So our organization implemented a knowledge base, and it was effective when we first turned it on, but over time the effectiveness is diminished. Mm-hmm. So what do I do?
So I would certainly say that in this exercise, I would recommend kind of doing a timeout, right? Let's really understand what we want to use the knowledge base for. So, as we kind of talk about this exchange, it needs to be alive, right? Because if it's not alive, it's not going to continue to grow, and if it's not going to continue to grow, it won't continue to provide value for the organization. So as you look to what this content is, it's very, very easy to create essentially an FAQ, but we're just going to put it into the structure of a knowledge base. That happens a lot as well. And just because you're using the knowledge base tool doesn't always mean that you have the knowledge base, ideologies. And so that's going to be an important decision that as an organization you'll need to make. Once you make that decision, then you can begin those structures of agent owning it, the working groups, and that constant repetition of going through and validating those answers.
So getting my agents to do anything is kind of like pulling teeth, right? So how do I get agents who are already handling a ton of calls, emails, chats today to contribute to this knowledge program, not just day one when we launch it, but actually once it's implemented and it goes live? How do you keep them engaged?
Yeah, and what we've seen in many organizations is exactly that, right? I mean, it's like, they already are, to the gills with all the workload that we have, but you have to imagine, right? That's how it is today, right? So with the advent of putting in a viable knowledge base for them to use, you can imagine how much efficiency that they're going to get, right? Because a lot of that struggle, as you talk about the workload, if your average handle time is 5 minutes, but it's 5 minutes, 2 minutes of which is that they have to get up, they have to go walk over to the person that knows, right? They have to walk over to Deb, they walk over to Deb, ask Deb a question, right? Go back to their desk, right? Is the call really 5 minutes, or is it just 3 minutes and then 2 minutes of walking around, right? And so if you think about that, what you're actually doing is that, yes, it is going to be a change in terms of their process, but it really allows them to stay all in one place, right? So for most knowledge bases, you'll have the ability to access it right there in your console. You'll be able to access it, get the answer you need, and you'll reduce that average handle time of 5 minutes down to 3 minutes or better in some cases.
We had a question from our live stream audience. So how should an organization evaluate knowledge management solutions to choose the quote unquote best one What questions should we ask about it?
That's an interesting question because, as you're looking at the different tools, every different tool is going to offer you this bell and whistle that, it's like, oh, this is what we do. And what I would tell you is that they all generally do the same things. But what I would ask you to really think about as you're talking about the tool selection is, what is it that your organization wants it to do, right? And I would start there, because as you're thinking about what the organization wants it to do, is it just purely about providing knowledge internally? Is it just about providing knowledge externally? Is it a crossover of the two? Or, is it where, in tools like Service Cloud, that you can actually begin to create a correlation, so now it fits into your volume diversion strategy, so that we know that issues that are submitted through this, or customers that actually look at this ticket, that they're actually tied to the type of ticket volume that we're receiving, so that you can actually get real-time analysis, or get a better visibility of how we are effectively diverting some of this volume.
We had another question from our live stream audience, and it is, a knowledge management solution can be expensive. What should an organization do to justify the cost of implementation and maintenance of that solution?
So, as you think about knowledge management, right, and we talk about volume diversion, right, that's probably, in the contact center world, volume diversion is huge, because we've seen, and we've seen this in real organizations, real places, when we've put in knowledge management and we've put in those types of tools, we've seen as much of as 25% volume diversion from the traditional channels of telephone, chat, and whatnot. And when you think about that, it's like for every 1,000 calls, you've reduced it by 250, right? And so as you take that number and you qualify that with how much your agents cost per hour, or how much calls are per minute, you can begin to do the math that way. But that would be the first way that I would start on an ROI calculation. The other thing that you want to look at is, you always also want to think about your retention, because the knowledge component, although it is very operationally centered, this is so that your agents can answer those questions. Agents that can answer the questions are definitely more likely to stay around than agents who struggle to find the answer. They get frustrated because, I don't know the answer. You keep asking me to give an answer that I never got in my training. So, you know what? Forget it, right? Mm-hmm. So that's something that I would add into your ROI. So it's about the operational calculation, plus also any type of potential HR implications.
So we had actually a couple more questions come in from our live stream audience. Thank you. How does a good knowledge base help reduce costs and increase satisfaction?
So a good knowledge base, as you talk about reducing costs, right? So there is the pure reducing cost in things like shortening your duration. If you shorten your duration, you create the capacity to take more calls, right? And so that certainly is a way that you can begin to calculate the effectiveness, because the difference between a 5-minute average handle time versus a 3-minute handle time is pretty huge in the world of contact centers. The other thing that I would say is, as you're talking about the knowledge base, and kind of how it pertains to, I forget the rest of the question.
That's all right. It increased satisfaction.
Thank you. So when you talk about increased satisfaction, the correlation is that if your customers are able to get those questions answered potentially without even talking to somebody, like imagine how much more satisfied they would be, right? Especially if you are a higher volume contact center and you may potentially have longer wait times, right? There's many times I've called up, a help desk, and they say, you are number 150 in line, and your approximate wait is 45 minutes. That's a fairly frustrating experience. But you know what? What if in that same scenario, I tried to call first, but then there's a message in there that says, hey, we also offer many of our answers here on our knowledge base. You may want to try there. And what you find is you actually find that customers are more satisfied, because if they have a simple answer, why make them suffer in line?
So I'm going to interpret this question, and the live person, or the live audience member who asked it can help clarify if I get it wrong. But I think the difference is they're trying to understand, I think, what the difference in, the impact of a knowledge base and maybe losing some of that collaborative agent engagement of me actually walking over to you and saying, what is the answer to this question? And so they're asking specifically around cost, but I think, how do you, versus sitting at a machine versus the actual collaboration that happens in a contact center, can you kind of drive into how that plays or how that impacts that?
So, so that was actually a question that a long time ago, I got into that with my workforce manager, right? And for a workforce manager, and many of the contact center folks out there, if you guys do have a workforce manager, they are there for one thing, and that is efficiency, right? It doesn't matter, like they want to know, the average handle time. They want to know, when your agent is, how long an average transfer takes. Is this a cold transfer? Is this a warm transfer, right? I mean, like they want to know to a T exactly how much time it takes so that they can quantify how many FTE that you need, right? Now, for me, as an operational guy, that's good to know, but I'm here for the experience of my agents. I'm here for the experience of my customers, and so, so that pairing is really, where the balance just it happens, right? And so what we have to really understand is we have to understand when we get into that type of discussion, what is the ideal balance, from the business perspective and also from the customer experience. So sometimes that ties into things like CSAT, customer satisfaction, or sometimes that ties into those hard metrics like average handle time. But then you can start to extrapolate.
Another question from our live stream audience: how does a good knowledge base help with training, time, and cost?
Yeah. So if you think about a good knowledge base, right? And so I'll go back with the example of Deb and Steven, or Walter, right? And so the idea here is that with a good knowledge base, what you actually do is you put in one single place all the information you ever need to be an agent, right? And it's not just information that we feel like you should know. This is the real information, because in a good knowledge base, we have that agent engagement, we have people actually contributing and creating that knowledge content. So what ends up happening is that because you actually have that accessible to them, you actually can see a reduction in the overall training time, right? Because what you might find is without a good solid knowledge base, you might have a 2-week training process, 4-week training process, because you're attempting to teach them every possible thing that you can think of. But the realities are, the calls that you get on an everyday basis may not actually fall within those guardrails, right? So with having that robust knowledge base, you can focus just on the procedures, then the content they'll find within the knowledge base, and you can really shorten that amount of time.
Thank you. This is a kind of a tactical question. So when I'm constructing my knowledge, how much content should be in a knowledge base article?
So, so there's a couple of thought processes with this. I actually am in the school of thought where, especially because the content is it's paired up with the contact center typically, and it's, whatever call that you get is gonna be kind of in the same line as this knowledge answer. I actually always recommend to keep whatever the same type of SLA that you have set up for your average speed to answer. So for instance, if your average speed to answer that you want to target 30 seconds, you should build your answers in that very same mindset, right? So it should answer the question in 30 seconds or less. So some systems like Oracle Service Cloud allow you to see how much average time that your customers are spending on the answer. So if your target is 30 seconds and you find that your customers are spending 8 minutes on the answer, that could lead to two things. That could tell you that they actually saw the answer, it didn't answer anything, they left it open, walked away, and they're frustrated now. Or it could tell you that they're hanging out on the answer, or even worse, is that they're too quick, right? So if you're targeting 30 seconds, but they're only on there for 10 seconds, they immediately see that this is not going to answer my question, and then they exit out, right? So by keeping those things in alignment, it makes it nice for you to kind of gauge in terms of effectiveness, and it still fits within a lot of those guidelines of the contact center metrics.
So another question, you talked earlier on how arduous it can be to publish an article in, say, regulated industries where marketing may have to approve it, or public relations, plus legal, plus several other lines of approvals before an article can actually go out and be visible to agents or to customers. So how would you best recommend an organization approach that type of problem?
So, in that group mentality, in the working group mentality, what you actually can do is there's a lot of moving parts that you can place in or out of that particular process. So very much so, if you have those types of approvals that need to happen, whether it's legal, marketing, or compliance or whatever, they can fit right in there. So the agent working group sees it, and once those things are vetted by the agent group in terms of how we do the process, then it can very easily migrate to a separate working group. And you can do those things in batch. So with a good knowledge base, if you're having those routine reviews, they're not getting 200 articles that they need to review legalese and compliance through. They're going to get the small batches in those periodical times.
Last question, unless I see any come through here. If you could pick 3 metrics to understand how your knowledge base is performing, what 3 metrics would you pick?
Sure. So one, it would be site visits, right? So if you're looking at knowledge base, your knowledge base should have the ability to tell you how many actual views you're getting on a knowledge answer, right? Because you may spend all this time and effort, but if it's literally been seen by one person in the last 30 days, the question I would ask is this really an effective answer? Or is this an answer anybody really cares to see? Versus some of the other ones where you may not really understand in terms of getting a lot of volume that you may not have ever expected. I would also add to that, I would add the average speed, right? So how much time that they're spending on those answers. And then last but not least, I would look at this really from a global view as well, right? Because if you're going to really be pushing agent ownership, it would be important for you to understand not just the submissions, but potentially the quality of those submissions, right? So if there's a way that you can tie into a quality program of reviewing the answers that are being submitted by agents, right? And so, typically in a past life, like, I had done QA for the contact center I was in. So I was able to really compare the QA scores versus the number of submissions, and that was a great way to keep the quality up.
Okay, thank you. Had another question just come in here from the live stream audience. I am frustrated with answers because they seem to be related. They don't seem to be related to my question, They seem to be related to my question, but aren't specific enough to actually answer it. How can an organization proactively fix this?
Yeah, so as you think about the average time on answer, right, and that's the metric that I like to use, right, so this is where it matches up with the average speed to answer. It's that, yes, we're talking about being able to provide an answer in 30 seconds or less, but it doesn't mean that it always just has to be one answer. It just means that people have a short attention span, and if you're going to take longer than 30 seconds, they're going to move on. So what really you can do is you can begin to really nest a lot of those answers together. So if it's a really complicated topic, instead of trying to shove everything in the same place, what you do is you set it up where the introduction is 30 seconds, and then that branches you out, just like a web page, right? It branches you out into different things. You can link to other answers, and through doing that, you've created a much deeper experience, but most importantly, now you're able to see exactly what part of the path that either they bailed, or you can see how much time they're spending on each. So if you do see something is a little more extended, then it allows you to really optimize that based on the type of content or the answer you want to give.
We had another question come in from our live stream audience. A knowledge answer will often have a question like, did this answer your question, yes or no? What can an organization do to get people to actually click one to help tune a system? Do people actually click yes or no?
So what we find is, we typically find it's usually about somewhere less than 10% of the people that actually go to an answer actually click that stuff. And the realities are, unless you're going to be offering prizes to click that button, I don't know if you're ever going to be able to 100% guarantee it. However, there are some things that you can certainly do. You can change the language to point them to say, hey, by providing this feedback, we're reviewing this on a regular basis, and we want to make this a better system for you. But also, I would also say that giving them the opportunity to do this and really just trying to up the volume in which your answers are going to happen. Right? So if only 10 people are on there, you're probably not going to see anybody answer, but if there's 1,000 people on there, you're probably more likely to see some kind of results.
Okay. Had another question come in from a live stream group, and the question is, should I have a separate knowledge base for my internal folks versus my outside customers who are accessing it? So should they be separate or should they be combined?
So, it really depends on the system that you use. Within Oracle Service Cloud, we actually recommend to put it all in the same place, right? Because if you're able to put conditional content, what we can do is we'll show the customer just the customer portion, but then it's very useful for your internal agents to see the type of content that your customers are seeing from the outside, right? So that not only can they be consistent, but then they can really build on what it is that the knowledge base is already saying.
Very good. And I think that wraps up our Q&A section.
Very good. All right, well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, who's this?